So good. I'm going to put this. Should I? Yeah. Is it on? Well, welcome on behalf of VCGA. Swamiji is going to talk about journey of the faith as a lecture. But before that, I wanted to bring about the issue of the books that he wrote. 2 books. My acquaintance with him happened to be maybe 5-6 years back when he came to Princeton University and lectured on infinite paths to infinite reality. And then I started reading that book. Eventually, the next one came maybe about a couple of years back, Swami Vivekananda's Cosmopolitanism. And I can tell you that they're extremely interesting, but academically challenging. And that is a fact. It requires multiple readings on the same topic or the same chapter to get a better picture of what he's saying. It just happened to be that today, Swamiji, I was looking at Academic Edu and I read the Peter Forrest from Australia, his review. So I'm just going to read from that. His review of in Journal of Philosophy of Religion. This is what he writes. His review of the second book. In his lucid and accessible book, Swami Medhanananda expounds Vivekananda's philosophy, locating it both in Indian and Western intellectual debates and establishing originality and enduring relevance. Medhanananda is a meticulous scholar, engaging not merely with those in the canon, such as Kant and John Stuart Mill, but many other philosophers like William Hamilton and Herbert Spencer. Medhananda exhibits Vivekananda as an original epistemologist, anticipating later trends. In the last section, Medhananda makes a good case that contemporary epistemologists of the religion should take a note of Vivekananda's contribution. And the last line he says, even when his philosophy is open to objection, it's original and thought-provoking. And I can tell you, it is thought-provoking. And I have been interacting him for last couple of years now. And I have found him to be brilliant and very scholarly. And honestly, I have learned a great deal by talking with him and learning from him. So welcome, Swami. We all appreciate your coming here. And just one more thing I want to mention. And a couple of people have asked me about what the check should be written to what. You can write Vedanta Center of Greater Austin or VCGA. So anyone that needs to write the check, please do so. And I think that I'll let Swami pick up from that on.
Thank you so much. Om Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swamini Tapaharini. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Very, very good.
Yes, very good morning, and good to see some familiar faces from yesterday and some new ones as well. So for those of you who were here yesterday, you know that it was a pretty heavy dose of philosophy. So I thought for a change of pace, we discuss a topic that it's not that it's not philosophical, but a little less philosophical and a little bit more directly practical in some ways, but also it might be a little bit frightening. So just a trigger warning. You know, these days they have these trigger warnings, at least in schools. So a bit of a trigger warning. I want to discuss faith in spiritual life. That's the topic. And I should also thank Rajandaji for a very generous and kind introduction. It's been a pleasure to know him in the past few years. Faith. What is faith? What is the role of faith in spiritual life? Why is it so important in spiritual life? And as spiritual aspirants, how do we know whether we're progressing in our spiritual life How do we know whether our faith in God is deepening? These are fundamental questions as spiritual aspirants. Those are the kinds of questions I want to try to answer today. The talk today will be based on chapter 8, the 8th chapter of this 10-chapter book, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, which you can purchase if you're interested. So if you want more details, please look at that chapter. So fundamentally, Swami Vivekananda, his claim is that faith is a journey. It's not static. It's not like we either have faith or we don't. Faith itself evolves and it deepens and it grows in the course of our spiritual life if we are sincere spiritual aspirants. Of course, the word faith has different meanings in different contexts. Some people, when they say, I have faith in God, what they mean is, I trust in God. That's one common understanding of faith. But I want to focus on a different understanding. It's related. It's not that it's completely separate from trust, but what I want to focus on is faith in the sense of believing that God exists. Really believing that God exists. So now, what Swami Vivekananda says, and how do I know what Swami Vivekananda says? I scoured the whole 9 volumes and did a kind of keyword search on faith and belief and all these things. And I find that he talks about faith in a number of different contexts. And what I try to do as a scholar is to put all these different statements about faith together in a coherent way. That's what's called reconstruction. In an academic sense, reconstruction means it's not like Swami Vivekananda wrote an article like I write articles. So he didn't write an article on faith. He has scattered remarks about faith in different lectures and some writings, and I'm trying to put them all together and make sense of them as a coherent whole. That's what an academic reconstruction is. So chapter 8 of my book is an academic reconstruction of Swami Vivekananda's views on faith, and specifically the journey of faith. And according to my reconstruction, and you can always feel free to disagree with my reconstruction, say, no, I think that Swamiji's views on faith are different, like that. I invite you to do that. But in any case, on my understanding of Swami Vivekananda's views on faith, the journey of faith has 3 major stages, okay? At the first stage, where probably most of us are, if we're honest with ourselves, we don't yet believe that God exists. And this might be frightening. This is the trigger warning part of it. We're all sitting here because we believe in God and we believe in Shri Ram Krishna. Many of us are initiated. When people ask us, co-workers, friends, do you believe in God? Of course, we'll say yes. But do we really? Do we really genuinely believe in God in the sense of believing that God exists? And you still might not be convinced. Of course we do. Otherwise, why would I pray? Why would I engage in spiritual practices like japa and come to arati and come to these satsangas? Just want you to think about these things. Ask yourself, do I really believe that God exists? So anyway, in any case, according to Swami Vivekananda, faith for most people, for the vast majority of spiritual aspirants on this earth, not just within Hinduism, but throughout this world, they don't begin spiritual life with the belief that God exists because they can't. Belief is not something that I just decide to have. Like, I'm going to believe today, starting today, that God exists. That's not the way that belief works. Just imagine. I'll tell myself, I'm going to believe that the capital of the United States is Idaho. Can I do that? Is it going to be possible for me? I can't just decide to believe something if it doesn't make any sense to me, if it doesn't sink into my heart. Same thing with belief in God's existence. It's not something that we can voluntarily just say, I'm going to now believe that God exists. In fact, it's a very high spiritual achievement to believe that God exists. We'll get to that. So the first stage in spiritual life is not belief that God exists, but intellectual assent. It's a very precise language that Swami Vivekananda uses in a number of places. He says, in the beginning of spiritual life, you don't believe that God exists, but you assent intellectually to the proposition that God exists. Okay, and I'm just summarizing it first, and then I'll go through each stage. But first stage, intellectual assent to the proposition that God exists. So intellectual assent to God. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. Second stage, and this is a much higher stage, I actually believe that God exists. I believe that God exists. So there's a crucial difference, according to Swami Vivekananda, between intellectual assent to God's existence and belief in God's existence. Belief is a much higher stage, but it's not the highest stage. Highest stage is the third and final stage. It's not just intellectual assent. It's not just belief, not even belief. It's direct spiritual realization of God, where there can be no more room for doubt. So these are the three stages in the journey of faith, according to Swami Vivekananda. And for the remainder of the talk, I want to just explain in more detail what these three stages consist in. What's the purpose? As spiritual aspirants, the first thing we should ask is, what stage do we belong to, if we're really honest with ourselves? And then, how do we progress to the subsequent stages, ultimately attaining God realization? So, stage one, the journey of faith begins with intellectual assent. What does Swamiji mean by intellectual assent? There's a passage which I'll read to you which helps. He says, this is one great idea to learn and to hold on to, this idea of realization. Only the man who has actually perceived God and soul has religion. There is no real difference between the highest ecclesiastical giant who can talk by the volume and the lowest, most ignorant materialist. We are all atheists. Let us confess it. Mere intellectual assent does not make us religious. Not 1 in 20 millions is a real Christian. He's speaking to a Western Christian audience, so it must have come as a shock to the audience there. But of course, he says the same thing in the context of India. In India, not 1 in 20 millions is a true Vedantan. He actually says it. So he's not picking on Christians here. Spiritual aspirants throughout the world, the vast majority of them do not actually believe in their deity, their conception of the divine. They intellectually assent to God's existence. That's what he's saying. So if we're honest with ourselves, we'll have to admit that most of us are atheists, not in the sense of we believe that God does not exist in a kind of extreme sense, but the idea is that we don't yet believe that God exists. We don't yet believe that God exists. We're on the way. We're trying to arrive at the belief that God exists, but we're not there yet, most of us. So to help us understand what he means by intellectual assent a little bit more, let me read you a couple more quotations. He says, this is in his lecture, The Love of God. He says, religion nowadays has become a mere hobby and fashion. People go to church like a flock of sheep. They do not embrace God because they need him. Most persons are unconscious atheists who self-complacently think that they are devout believers. This last sentence, let's repeat that. Most persons are unconscious atheists. They don't even know that they're atheists. They talk big about God, but in fact, they're atheists. Most persons are unconscious atheists who self-complacently think that they are devout believers. Why self-complacent? Because it's a great way to flatter the ego, to think that I'm more advanced in spiritual life than I actually am. Of course I believe in God. Why are you even asking me? What a dumb question. You see, self-complacency. We're very content with believing in God. Yes, I'm one of the greatest believers of God in the world. Another passage, Swami Vivekananda says, the vast majority of people are atheists. I am glad that in modern times, another class of atheists has come into existence in the Western world. I mean the materialists. They are sincere atheists. He's praising Richard Dawkins and others now they are better than the religious atheists. It's a very interesting phrase, religious atheists. They are better than the religious atheists who are insincere, who fight and talk about religion and yet do not want it. Never try to realize it. Never try to understand it. Remember the words of Christ. Ask and it shall be given you. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. These words are literally true, not figures or fiction. Who wants God? That is the question. Do you think that all this mass of people in the world want God and cannot get him? That cannot be. Very provocative passage. He's praising the materialists. Why? Because they're at least sincere about being atheists. And most religious people are unconscious atheists, but who talk themselves hoarse, preaching God to others without knowing a thing about God and not even having the belief in God. This statement of Christ that Swamiji quotes here, ask and it shall be given, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. It reminds me of something that happened in my own life long back when I was at Oxford University for a year as an undergrad. And I was already a kind of spiritual seeker, but hadn't settled on a religion yet. And I never believed that because I was born a Hindu and raised Hindu, I should be Hindu. I was very open. So I'm reading the Bible, reading the Quran, reading Dhammapada, reading Bhagavad Gita, and considering my options, shopping, spiritual shopping. And I had a good friend at Oxford who is a Christian. So I was having lots of debates with him. And as a Christian, he's saying, look, if you open yourself to Christ, then he'll reveal himself to you, this, that, something like that. And I remember saying, because I'd read the Bible, and so I quoted this statement, knock and the door shall be open. I said, I'm knocking, but nobody's answering. And I was 19 at the time, 19 or 20. But now I realize it's much more difficult to knock than I thought. See, I thought that knocking means intellectual inquiry, basically. I'm reading the Bible, I'm a smart guy, and yet I'm not getting any response from God. That's not what knocking means. That's not what Jesus meant by knocking. Knocking is a very high state. See, ask and it shall be given you. Seek and ye shall find. Are we seeking in our heart of hearts? That's the question. It's not just a mere intellectual inquiry. That was my mistake, to think that. I was a very arrogant young undergraduate then. Seeking, asking, knocking. This is a very high spiritual state, actually. It's what Sri Ramakrishna used to call vyakulata in Bangla. Intense longing for God. How many of us can honestly say that we feel that longing for God? That's the question. So, why does Swami Vivekananda emphasize so strongly this contrast between intellectual assent to God's existence and genuine belief in God's existence? What's the difference? He says that if you genuinely believe in God, you cannot help but act in this world as if God exists. Right? If you really believe that God exists, every single one of your actions, thoughts, and words would reflect that belief. And how many of us can honestly say that our lives are really aligned with the belief that God exists? I'll give you a simple example. I'm walking across the street, slowly, taking my own time, and then suddenly I see a giant truck coming toward me. And if I don't get out of the way soon, I'll be crushed, obviously, killed. I believe that there's a giant truck hurtling towards me. If I really believed that, what would I do? I would jump out of the way as quickly as possible if I really believed it. If I really believed it. And if I say that there's a truck hurtling towards me, and yet I don't bother to get out of the way, what should people rightly assume? You didn't really believe that there's a truck coming towards you. Do you see what I mean? Unless I want to commit suicide, of course. But let's say I don't. Likewise, if I really believed that God exists, wouldn't I live my life completely differently from ordinary people? Wouldn't I spend every waking moment trying to realize God? That's the question. So those who just intellectually assent to God's existence, their lives are not saturated with God consciousness yet, with that longing to realize God. But this first stage, this first category of intellectual assent is a very broad one. So I don't want anybody to lose hope here. Most of us fall under this first category. But there are intellectual assenters and intellectual assenters. Swamiji distinguishes between insincere intellectual assenters and sincere intellectual assenters. So hopefully you fall under the sincere category. And some of you maybe already realize, so that would be wonderful. Swamiji says, the man who says that he believes in religion and never attempts to realize it is not sincere. This is Swamiji's definition. The man who says, the person who says that she believes in religion and never attempts to realize it is not sincere. So the mark of sincerity as a spiritual aspirant is that you know where you're honest about where you stand now, and you're making a sincere effort to engage in spiritual practices to purify the mind, to eliminate egoism and selfishness, in order to make further progress in spiritual life. That's the mark of a sincere intellectual assenter. I don't have belief in God, but I'm honest with myself. And I want to ultimately get to the point where I can genuinely believe in God and ultimately realize God. And so let me live my life in such a way that I can make progress in spiritual life. That's a sincere spiritual aspirant. An insincere one, by contrast, is somebody who is in stage 1. No question of belief. This person is just intellectually assenting to God's existence, but claiming that they're already at stage 2 or worse, stage 3. That they've already, oh, yeah. Oh, last night I had a really nice conversation with Sri Ramakrishna, and he's doing fine, by the way. And I've heard this a lot from people. Not from monks, but usually from devotees. Monks. So that's the problem. Insincere spiritual aspirants are those who are stuck at stage 1, but pretend they're at stage 2 or stage 3. Self-deception. I mentioned yesterday that I gave a whole lecture on self-deception in spiritual life. So this is one of the ways that we deceive ourselves. The ego is deeply invested in making us think that we are far more spiritually advanced than we actually are. The trick of the ego is that even spiritual life becomes another source of ego. Spiritual pride. This is one of the most terrible things. Swami Vivekananda says, even after a monk has renounced lust and greed, the greatest danger is to develop spiritual pride. That's why among the direct disciples, I think it was Brahmanandaji who turned to a brother disciple and said, hey, why does Girwa? Because it's attracting attention, it's putting us on a pedestal. Don't you think it would be better to just wear white? Wouldn't it be simpler? That we have to be very, very careful. Even wearing the Girwa itself could become a source of ego. Okay, so that's enough about the harrowing stage 1, where most of us are. How do we make spiritual progress? How do we progress from stage 1, intellectual ascent, to stage 2, and ultimately to the goal of realization? So the second stage, this is the stage when we actually believe that God exists. As I said, it's a very, very high spiritual achievement. Let's see how Swami Vivekananda explains this stage. This is taken from his lecture, Preparatory and Supreme Bhakti Yoga, 1896. It's a long passage, but it's very, very dense and deep. So let's concentrate. Swami Vivekananda says, a great sage used to say, suppose there is a thief in a room, and somehow he comes to know that there is a mass of gold in the next room, and that there is only a thin partition between the 2 rooms. What would be the condition of that thief? He would be sleepless. He would not be able to eat or do anything. His whole mind would be on getting that gold. Do you mean to say that if all these people really believed that the mine of happiness, of blessedness, of glory were here, they would act as they do in the world without trying to get God? That's the end of this quotation. Who is this great sage? Anyone? Quiz. Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna himself. So Swami Vivekananda is indirectly quoting Sri Ramakrishna here. Then Swami Vivekananda continues, as soon as a man begins to believe there is a God, notice the word belief here. As soon as a man begins to believe there is a God, he becomes mad with longing to get to him. Others may go their way, but as soon as a man is sure that there is a much higher life than that which he is leading here, as soon as he feels sure that the senses are not all, that this limited material body is as nothing compared with the immortal, eternal, undying bliss of the self, he becomes mad until he finds out this bliss for himself. And this madness, this thirst, this mania is what is called the awakening to religion. And when that has come, a man is beginning to be religious. But it takes a long time. Swamiji continues. All these forms and ceremonies, these prayers and pilgrimages, these books, bells, candles, and priests are the preparations. They take off the impurities from the soul And when the soul has become pure, it naturally wants to get to the mine of all purity, God himself. Just as, now he's bringing in another wonderful metaphor of his Guru Sri Ramakrishna's. He says, Swamiji says, just as a piece of iron which had been covered with the dust of centuries might be lying near a magnet all the time and yet not be attracted to it. But as soon as the dust is cleared away, the iron is drawn by the magnet. So, when the human soul, covered with the dust of ages, impurities, wickednesses, and sins, after many births, becomes purified enough by these forms and ceremonies, by doing good to others, loving other beings, its natural spiritual attraction comes. It wakes up and struggles towards God. It's a very, very powerful passage, very, very important, very practical in spiritual life too. We can test ourselves, we can ask ourselves, do we really feel that longing for God? If we don't, we can be sure we don't believe in God. Certainly we're sincere spiritual aspirants. But let's be honest, most of us are at stage 1. We're not yet at the stage where we can genuinely say, I believe that God exists. Are we really in the condition of that thief who believes that there's a priceless treasure in the next door? And we sit around and say, oh, but that's fine, maybe in my next life. No, impossible, impossible. If you really believed that there's a priceless treasure next door, you would spend all of your waking energy trying to get to that. So Swamiji says, our beliefs are reflected in our behavior. This is fundamental. I gave you the example of the truck coming. That should explain pretty simply what I mean by that, what he means by that. If we really believe that God exists, we couldn't help but act and live in this world as if God exists. Our whole life would be centered around God. And how many of us can say that it is? The other thing is this iron and magnet analogy, which Sri Ramakrishna was fond of. Sri Ramakrishna usually, he would say a needle. There's a needle which is naturally attracted to a giant magnet. What is that giant magnet? God. That's just the nature of physics, that there's a natural attraction. But why is it that the needle, the soul, the needle here is the individual soul. Why is it that I don't feel that longing for God? Because of all these layers of impurity. And Sri Ramakrishna says, through prayer, he says, pray with tears in your eyes. Confess all of your sins and weaknesses to God. Those tears will wipe away the mud covering the needle of the soul. This is very beautiful. Once that mud is wiped away, what happens? The natural attraction and longing of the soul for God just manifests. Finally, it becomes manifest. For so many lifetimes, it hasn't been manifest. It's covered over by impurities. What is the purpose of all spiritual practice? Removing those layers of mud, to let our innate longing and attraction for God manifest. We're all lovers of God, in fact. We are all bhaktas, genuine bhaktas. We're all longing for God, yet we don't feel it. We don't feel it because of our worldly attachments and desires. Through spiritual practice, we become pure, and then we manifest our innate longing and love of God. So the priority in spiritual life for the vast majority of spiritual aspirants should be chitta shuddhi. That's the term in Sanskrit. Purification of mind and heart. What does purification mean? Try to eliminate worldly and reduce and ultimately eliminate worldly attachments and desires as much as possible. So of course, Swamiji knows, and he sort of, he likes rubbing it in, that there are very few genuine spiritual aspirants in the world who actually believe that God exists. And he says it, as I said, not 1 in 20 millions, he says, is a true Christian. Not 1 in 20 millions is a true Vedantan. In fact, he says in another lecture, he said, my guru, Sri Ramakrishna, used to say, not 1 in 20 millions in this world believed in God. He's quoting his guru. Sri Ramakrishna himself was very emphatic about this. Most people don't believe in God. Proof? This is taken directly from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna says, one cannot even believe that God exists until one's heart becomes pure. অন্তর শুদ্ধ না হলে ঈশ্বর আছেন বলে বিশ্বাসই হয় না. One cannot even believe that God exists until one's heart becomes pure. These are Sri Ramakrishna's own words. Until we attain purity of mind and purity of heart, we cannot genuinely believe that God exists. So in fact, even among spiritual aspirants, the vast majority of spiritual aspirants don't believe in God. But most of them will talk as if they believe in God. And that's okay. You can talk about, not that you should never talk about God, but know in your heart of hearts that that talk is not yet that very high level of belief that we're aiming toward, right? And let's be a little bit careful. I think as Vedantins, we should be a little bit modest about, what happens sometimes is, of course, you guys know in the US, in the context of the US, born again Christians, the moment they convert to Christianity, they become Christian zealots and they spend most of their energy trying to convert others, without having achieved anything themselves. So let's not make that mistake. Sometimes parents are like this, who first get into Vedanta, they become so excited that they force feed Vedanta to their 5-year-old kids. And they tell me sometimes, Maharaj, I'm bringing my kids to the center all the time. They're not interested. I said, don't. You know what I tell them? I say, thank God that my parents were not they didn't raise me in this tradition. Because if they did, I would never become a monk of the Ramakrishna order. Because I don't like feeling coerced. I need to know, I need to feel that I came to this tradition on my own. Because it genuinely came from within. Not because my parents expect me to do this and that. So long as our mind is impure, so long as we have worldly attachments and desires, what happens? We don't think of God. Not just that, this world is much more attractive to us than God is, and therefore this world is much more real to us than God is. That's the logic. That's why so long as our mind is full of worldly attachments and desires, we cannot believe genuinely that God exists. We cannot. The world just, when I look at the world, it just feels, I experience it as far more real to me than God. That's why Swami Vivekananda in 1887, 1 year after Sri Ramakrishna's passing, he told the future Swami Trigunatitanandaji, so Prasanna was his name. Swami Vivekananda tells him, so long as one has desires and cravings, one does not believe that God exists. Jotokkhon kamona basana totokkhon ishwarke abhishas. These are hard words. These are hard words, but we should think about them deeply. So, philosophers. Now, I said this wouldn't be too philosophically heavy, but I want to talk briefly about something that is a little bit technical, but hopefully it'll be understandable. Philosophers, contemporary philosophers, they write a lot about belief formation. How do we form beliefs? And there's this concept called doxastic voluntarism. This is a very fancy term, but it's a very simple idea. Doxastic voluntarism. Voluntarism, voluntary, doing something voluntarily, consciously. Doxastic just is a fancy adjective referring to belief. So doxastic voluntarism is the view that I can just decide to adopt a belief at will. Like I said, I can just decide to believe that Idaho is the capital of the US, for instance, something like that. Most philosophers reject doxastic voluntarism. They say that that's just not the way that belief formation works. I can't just decide to believe something and then believe it. You see, so actually how a belief forms, it happens spontaneously. This is how most philosophers think of belief formation. Not that I consciously decide to believe something and then magically I have that belief, but that when the conditions are right, the belief will spontaneously arise. How does this apply to God? The idea is, no matter how much we try to believe that God exists, through our own efforts, voluntarily, we can never believe that God exists. That belief arises spontaneously in our hearts after many lifetimes of spiritual practice, many lifetimes of self-purification. And even then, once we've attained that chitta shuddhi, it's not by our own efforts, but by God's grace that belief in God arises. That's the crucial thing. But what can we do as sincere spiritual aspirants, let's say mostly at the first stage in our long journey of faith? What can we do? We should try to engage sincerely in spiritual practices in order to purify our hearts and minds. And we should be very honest with ourselves. and not pretend that we're more advanced, further along in this journey of faith in spiritual life than we really are. Even if we're not honest to anyone else, let's be honest with God and let's be honest with ourselves. So that's belief. If the true sign of genuine belief in God is a tremendous longing to realize God. That's the sign. That's the criterion. Until we have that, we know for sure we don't have that belief. We're still stuck at stage 1. But belief is not the end goal in this journey of faith. The end goal is realization. So if that longing is sufficiently intense, imagine, just go back to that incident in Sri Ramakrishna's life, when his longing grew so intense that he couldn't even live with himself anymore without realizing Mother Kali. He took the sword from the stand and was about to slit his throat, and then he had the realization. That kind of longing, not encouraging anyone to commit suicide. So this is what Swami Vivekananda says about this third stage in this journey of faith. He says, this is from his lecture Realization, delivered in London in 1896. He says, if you have seen a certain country and a man forces you to say that you have not seen it, still, in your heart of hearts, you know you have. So when you see religion and God in a more intense sense than you see this external world, nothing will be able to shake your belief. Then you have real faith. These are Swamiji's words. Then you have real faith. This is the culmination of the journey of faith. Not just intellectual assent, not even belief, which is a very high state, which most of us have not attained, but direct realization. Because only when we attain direct realization can all doubts finally be dispelled. We can't doubt it because we see God directly. When Swami Vivekananda was running around Kolkata asking great sages, have you seen God? Have you seen God? Swami said, yes. He's more, I'm talking to him, I see him as a greater reality than I'm talking to you now. God is more real to me than you are. That's realization. That's that third and culminating stage. So faith, this is the beauty of Vedanta. We talked about this briefly. Oh no, I think I talked about this in Houston actually. It was one of my talks in Houston in the Q&A. Swami Vivekananda in Raja Yoga, he spends a lot of ink trying to prove that science, that religion is a science just as much as physics or chemistry or biology is. And his main argument is, what's the essence of any science? It needs to be based on direct verification. And he says, by that criterion, religion is just as much of a science as any other science, any natural science. Why? Because it's equally based on direct verification. So the beauty of Vedanta is faith. Faith will begin with intellectual assent. We can have belief, but in the end, there must be direct experiential verification of that belief. We can only arrive at that verification through realization. Let's realize God for ourselves, and then we can verify the truth of religion. So each one of us is a spiritual scientist. Each one of us is conducting an experiment. The laboratory is our own human body. And the aim is to verify the truth of religion, the truth of God, by directly experiencing it for ourselves. So, as I said, don't be frightened by this. There are a couple things. What are the implications for spiritual practice? What do we get out of this talk and Swamiji's views on faith? The first step in spiritual life is what I call brutally honest self-assessment. Okay? Self-assessment is not enough. Self-assessment, the moment you say self-assessment, we'll be giving glowing reviews of ourselves. That's the ego. Oh yeah, everything's great. And what do I need to change? I'm already a very advanced spiritual soul. No, brutally honest self-assessment. And if you're not good at being brutally honest with yourself, I'm sure your spouse will help. Or your kids, they'll take you down a couple notches. Yeah, mom, that's... So let's be honest with ourselves. And with the help of loved ones, I'm sure we can all succeed in doing that. Swami Vivekananda used to say, out of those who take to spiritual life, 80% become cheats, 15% become mad, crazy, and only 5% succeed. These are daunting numbers, By engaging in this brutally honest self-assessment, we can ensure that we're not in that 80% category. Because it's very dangerous. Those cheats, the problem is that category is broad. Cheats means those who cheat others, but know that they're cheating them. But even worse and more insidious, those who cheat themselves without knowing it. That's self-deception. I don't even know that I'm a cheat. What a terrifying proposition. Going nowhere fast, going backwards. I'm rowing the boat thinking I'm going forward, and yet there's an anchor which is preventing from even moving 1 inch. It's terrifying. So let's be on our guard. Let's be very, very careful about hypocrisy and self-deception in spiritual life. That's very, very important. What stage are we at now? Let's be honest with ourselves. This is not, the purpose of this is not to judge others, to judge ourselves. Turn the mirror on yourself. What stage am I at, honestly? And how do I make progress to the further stages? Simplest way, engage sincerely in spiritual practices, pray to God, try to purify your mind of all worldly attachments and desires. And by doing that, we will definitely attain genuine belief in God and ultimately attain realization. Thank you. So questions? A bit shorter talk.
Well, let's see who wants to start.
Well, let me
For
start.
you, okay.
Oh.
It's on.
Maharaj, Swami Vivekananda said he's an atheist who does not believe in God. That's the old religion.
Mm.
The new religion says he's an atheist who does not believe in himself.
Mm.
Will you please be able to expand on that?
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, look, one thing is we have to be, I think it's important to place Swami Vivekananda in his historical context. Context was late 19th century India, colonial India. The country is steeped in tamas. And Indians had this kind of inferiority complex, what Swami Vivekananda used to call the slave mentality. Dinheen bhab in Bangla. I'm no good, I'm a sinner, I'm useless, I'm weak, I'm this, I'm that, blaming other people for their problems, not taking responsibility for themselves, not having faith in themselves, not believing in themselves, atmabishwash in Bengali, not having that faith and belief in oneself. That was the situation at the time. So what did Swamiji say to his fellow Indians? He says, the first thing you need to do to grow spiritually is to have faith in yourself. Because faith in God is, in Bangla you'd say durir kotha. That's a much higher state. Until you believe in yourself, you can never believe in God. What is, there's some problem with.
Turn off the mic.
Yeah.
Is it mine?
Okay.
So in another place, controversially, Swami Vivekananda said to the youth of India, better to play football than to read the Bhagavad Gita. Why would he say that? I'm saying this is very much along the lines of what he's saying about now what atheist means is to believe somebody who doesn't believe in himself. It's the same idea. In that historical context, what is he saying? Is he saying that we shouldn't read the Gita? Obviously not, even though some people claim that that's what he said. That's clearly not what he said. No, what he's saying is you guys are incredibly tamasic. You're lazy. You have no faith in yourselves. Build your muscles. Have some faith in yourselves. Have some strength. Only then can you appreciate the strength of Krishna and Arjuna. Only then can you begin to understand the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita and these other great spiritual scriptures. Likewise, forget about having faith in God, talking yourself hoarse about God. If you don't have faith in yourself, you'll never have faith in God. So I see it in that context.
I think it's working.
Hello? Can you hear me? So you were mentioning at the age of 19, you were at Oxford and you were knocking.
I thought I was knocking. It turned out I wasn't, but yeah.
But you read Bible, you read all.
Not all, but yeah, some.
But what made you decide to follow Vedanta? How did you decide to follow Vedanta?
Yeah, it's a good question. So a few things. One was, well, I love Gita. And what I loved about it is that it's very rational. It resonated with me because I from a young age, I wanted to be a monk. And I was just convinced that without renunciation, you can't really make genuine spiritual progress. So that's one thing. But also, because I was raised here, born and raised in the US, and a critical thinker, I just never believed in being born into a religion. It didn't make sense to me. Like, there's no reason why I should blindly accept the religion I'm born into. No, it needs to be my own. So I was looking at Hinduism critically. And one of the things that, when I was a spiritual shopper, as I call it, reading the different world religious scriptures, one very urgent question to me is, are any of these true? And if so, if one of them is true, then the others must be false. This is just a kind of logical way of thinking for many people. Then I better decide, I better choose carefully. Because out of all of these options, only one of them is true. Or maybe all of them are false. That's also a possibility. I was agnostic, basically. And so I was open to the possibility that none of them are true. What didn't occur to me is that all of them can be valid paths. All of them true in a certain sense. We have to be careful about in what sense here. I'm very critical of a trend that I call lazy harmonizing, which means, oh yes, Christianity is true, Islam is true, Judaism is true, Hinduism is true, everything is true, Buddhism is true. What's the problem with that? Can anyone think of what the problem with saying that is? It's a wonderful sentiment. What's wrong with it? Anyone?
I need to work on the one. Eventually, I have to work on the one.
Well, okay, that's one issue, but I'm not even talking about spiritual practice. I'm just saying, to say that all of these religions are true at the same time itself, I think very clearly commits you to certain flagrant contradictions. What do I mean? Did Christ die on the cross? Christianity says yes. What does Islam say? Anyone know?
No.
Islam says no, Christ did not die on the cross. Karma and rebirth. Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox Islam, Orthodox Judaism say no such thing as karma, no such thing as rebirth. What does Hinduism say? What does Buddhism say? What does Jainism say? Sikhism? There is karma and rebirth. So when I say that Christianity is true and Islam is true, I'm saying Christ did die on the cross, Christ did not die on the cross. When I'm saying that Hinduism is true and Buddhism is true and Christianity is true and Judaism is true, then I'm saying yes, karma and rebirth are true, and yes, karma and rebirth are false. I'm a madman. So that can't be the way to think about things. Not that all religions are true in that sort of literal sense. What this tradition of Vedanta helped me to see after I started studying the works of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Medhanandaji is that you don't have to be a lazy harmonizer, but you can still appreciate the harmony of all religions in a different way. What's the different way? They are all different paths to the same goal. And there's no higher and lower. And it's a matter of temperament and context and circumstances, which path you decide. And then I can't circle back to my own upbringing as a Hindu, and I can appreciate it now. My first thing was, because I was born Hindu, let me sort of be skeptical toward it and this and that. Now I see, with karma and rebirth, there's a good reason why I was born into a Hindu family. Maybe because I was a Hindu in my previous life, a Vedantan already, and I'm trying to hit the ground running in this life, you see. So even that I came back to and appreciated the importance of it. But only after I made Hinduism and Vedanta my own. I still strongly feel that you should not just blindly accept what your parents tell you and what society tells you. That's not the right way forward, in spiritual life at least, because it's too important and too personal a journey for anyone else to dictate to you what you should believe or not believe. So one of the main things is that attracted me to this tradition in particular is that I can appreciate what's great and what's true in every religion, in every spiritual path, while still standing firm to my own, sticking firmly to my own. So that's very powerful. Another thing is something that Swami Medhanandaji emphasized again and again, which I found very powerful, which is that religion can be verified. Each one of us as spiritual aspirants should try to verify religion for ourselves. It's not just a matter of blind faith. Because again, being raised in the West, especially because I was an academic, and the higher up you go in the academic echelon, the more skeptical people are, your colleagues. 98% of academics don't believe. They're atheists or agnostics. You see. And so you're constantly confronted with these difficult questions about religion. How do I know that God exists? What are the arguments for God's existence? And Swami Vivekananda gives good arguments, rational arguments for God's existence. I have a whole chapter on that in this book. This is chapters 4, 5, and 6 of this book. Is all about religion as a science. What is a good argument for believing that God exists? These are very, very deep and difficult philosophical questions. And Swamiji gives good answers, which are still relevant now. So for all these reasons, maybe more reasons too, but that's the beginning of an answer. Thank you.
You know, I grew up Hindu, but for me, faith also was sort of fear-inducing
Yeah.
in some ways, because if you don't do this, you get that. That sort of cause effect, so to speak, that religion drives. Could you talk a little bit about just the oppression of fear, right? That religion and faith also seems to, inculcate on people, and then of course the ideas of inequality, right? Like the idea that everyone's not equal, and how does one, in some ways, believe in a belief that in some ways has really wonderful things to say about realization, but then there's also a whole canon of information around, just not really great things too. So I'd love to understand how you sort of manage that inside you, how do you manage the contradictions of religion, so to speak?
Okay, yeah, this is a very thoughtful question. I think there are two questions. So the first one is about religion being based on instilling fear in us. And I think we should be careful about not overgeneralizing. I think that there are different religions, and different religions to varying extents emphasize this fear element. And I think one of the nice things about Hinduism is that you don't really find that so much. I don't want to say it's completely non-existent. And in fact, there are some more sectarian and fanatical traditions within Hinduism which do use fear as one of their main tactics for kind of converting you into their belief system. That's true. If you don't accept what we're doing, you're going to go to a hell. There even is there's some, fortunately, minority views within Hinduism which believe in an eternal hell. Madhva's Dvaita Vedanta is one of them. Madhva distinguishes three categories of jiva. It's called jiva taratamya, which means a hierarchy of jivas. Only the top category of jivas, the mukti yogyas, are capable of attaining mukti, liberation. But there are two lower categories. One is the nitya samsaris, who are doomed to transmigrate endlessly, take births again and again with no escape. If you thought that was bad, there's a worse category. Tamo yogyas, those souls who are destined for the darkness of eternal hell. Doesn't this sound like Catholicism or something? But this is Hinduism, and this is Madhva. Of course, it's not Hinduism as a whole, but it's one sub-tradition within Hinduism. It's Madhva's Dvaita Vedanta. And so you'll find that there is this bit of a fear element. The moment you say that some souls are destined for eternal hell, obviously you don't want to be in that category. I studied literature and philosophy, and so I studied James Joyce's work pretty carefully, and he wrote this beautiful book called A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Has anyone read it? Nobody in this entire room. I'm amazed. Okay. But anyway, he talks about his own Catholic upbringing in Ireland. And it's all about hellfire, and unless you're a Catholic, and unless you do X, Y, and Z, you're going straight to hell, doomed to be there for an eternity. And he just very vividly, beautifully describing the terror that he felt as an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, having to hear these things from priests. So that's another plus point in Vedanta, is that we have universal liberation. That's the doctrine. This is the doctrine that every single soul will ultimately attain the highest goal of liberation. Every single soul, without exception, will realize God, will realize their own higher self. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, everybody will be fed. Some people at 6 in the morning, others at 12 noon, others at 6 p.m., others at midnight, but nobody will be left unfed. All these different meal times correspond to what? Different lifetimes. 6 a.m. means maybe in this life. Very few people in this life are going to get it, but maybe we're one of the lucky few, lottery winners. Others, 12 p.m. That means maybe after 10 lifetimes. The midnight people will be maybe Hitler's, Even Hitler, the soul of Hitler, will attain liberation, but he won't be Hitler anymore. He'll be a saint by the time he gets liberation. You see, Hitler was an outer covering. We're all outer coverings. Shrabuji used to point to his own body and say, Kol matro. It's just a kind of pillowcase. Deeper soul is what's eternal. It's the journey of the soul. That's what spiritual life is about. Every single soul will ultimately attain liberation in the end.
Online people can't.
Voice not working?
Yeah.
Oh, God. Sorry.
So I just wanted to ask you, Swamiji, like, how do you, like, there's a sense of contradiction happens in your mind, and I'm just speaking from myself, that when we talk about faith and a concept of critical inquiry. So how do you deal with that? And especially when you talked about at the first phase where we all are in an intellectual ascent, like there is a constant kind of tug of war happening between that. And how do you mitigate that to aspire to go to the next stage? Like how do you kind of work with that contradiction? That's, and especially as you mentioned, like as you try to read more, or as you listen to other people, and the sense of critical inquiry becomes more and more. And so how do you kind of handle that?
That's a good question. Read chapter 7 of my book. I'm now plugged like some 4 or 5 chapters of my book. Chapter 7 of my book is all about this, because what Swamiji says is faith is not blind. He encourages, as a Vedantin, rationally grounded faith, reasonable faith. How is it reasonable? That's why I have chapters 4 through 6. There's a kind of logical sequence to my chapters. What Swamiji says is, it's reasonable for us to believe that God exists and to engage in spiritual practice, to be spiritual aspirants. Why? Because there are good arguments for God's existence. And the best one that he gives, I think, and he also thinks this, it's not, in Christian theology, you have all sorts of elaborate arguments based on, like one of the most famous is the argument from design. If you just look at the world, especially nature, it just seems as if there's a kind of purpose behind the way that this world's creation is. And that suggests a maker. And that maker has to be all powerful, so therefore we have a kind of God. No, but according to Swamiji, the best argument for God's existence is along very different lines. It's what contemporary philosophers call the argument from spiritual experience or religious experience. And the idea is there are people throughout the world who claim to have directly experienced God. That's the first premise. There's no reason to believe that they're trying to actively deceive us. It's another premise. Third, we cannot live in this world rationally without believing the following epistemic principle. This is a fancy term, but it just means, it's hard to explain. But anyway, I'll explain what the principle is. Then you'll understand what I mean. If I experience something to be so, it's reasonable for me to believe that it is so. If I experience a laptop, it's reasonable for me to believe that there's a laptop in front of me. You might be thinking this is obvious. This is duh. Why are you telling me this? That's true. It should be obvious. Then the argument is working if it's obvious. Secondly, another principle that all of us believe in all the time, and we couldn't function rationally in the world without accepting this another epistemic principle. It's called the principle of testimony. It is reasonable for us to believe the testimony of others who claim to experience things. What's an example? We read newspapers all the time, and we don't always doubt what's. Of course, nowadays with fake news, it's a little bit trickier. But okay, but let me give you another example. I'm at home. I'm about to go to work, and my dad says, "Hey, take an umbrella. It's raining out." Well, I say, "Hey," unless it's April Fool's. If it's April Fool's and I know my dad's a jokester, then I might doubt whether he's serious. But set that aside. What do? Of course, I'll accept what he says. That's his perceptual testimony, because he looks out the window, sees that it's raining, and then he tells me, I don't need to look out the window. I'll accept what he says on faith, and it's reasonable. People do it all the time. I take an umbrella, and then lo and behold, when I go outside, I see it is raining, and my dad was right. But my attitude is not one of skepticism and prove to me, Dad, that it's raining. This is silly. No. So now, here's the trick. If you accept those two epistemic principles, those principles apply just as much to spiritual experiences as to ordinary sense experiences. Not just about seeing whether it's raining outside, but there are people throughout the world, in all countries, who claim to have directly experienced God. And if we accept these two epistemic principles, then they apply just as much to spiritual experiences and reports about spiritual experiences as they do to sense perceptual experiences. And finally, what does this argument lead to? And all the details are in chapters 5 and 6 of my book here on Vivekananda. The ultimate conclusion of the argument, what it establishes, is that it's reasonable for us to believe that God exists on the basis of the testimony of others who claim to have directly experienced God. People like Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda and Jesus and others. You see, it's a very powerful argument, actually. And of course, just because it's powerful doesn't mean that it's a simple argument or that everybody should be immediately convinced by it. Chapter 6 is addressing, what I do is I address many different objections that different philosophers have raised against the argument. And I try to defend the argument against those criticisms and objections. So it's complicated, but in any case, that in a nutshell is why Swami Vivekananda says, why Vedanta in general says, you should start your spiritual life with the faith in God, but it's a reasonable faith. It's a rationally grounded faith. You see, it's not just arbitrary or, and so the thing is, if somebody asks you, I actually, during my agnostic phase, like I spent a year in Germany, and I was staying with a nice Christian family, and the father in that host family was a professor of philosophy and a Christian. And so I asked him just point blank, I said, what's the basis of your faith? In German. And he responded, tradition. And that turned me off somehow. Just saying tradition is not, that felt like blind faith to me, and I thought to myself, that's not the kind of tradition I want to belong to. Tradition's not enough. That's one thing, but just believing in something because of tradition, because your parents told you, because this book tells you, that's not good enough for me. I only answered your first question. Your second question was about this, the contradictions of religion and how there are very sublime things in religion. There are also some not so sublime things in religion. I think that a very helpful practical principle is one that Sri Ramakrishna used to say. He said, it's impossible to translate. So I'm going to say the Bangla and then I'll roughly try to convey the meaning. He said, Golmal ache. Gol ta baad diye, mal ta nao, mal shudu nao. Impossible to translate. Okay, but let me try. Okay, golmal. Golmal means trouble. The word golmal in Bangla means trouble. But the word itself, he's punning on the word, is comprised of two smaller words. The word mal in golmal means essence, or what's good and positive in something. And gol again means trouble, the bad part. So he says, when you're confronted with something which is a mixture of good and bad, positive and negative, sublime and the ridiculous, or the pernicious or the evil, what should the sensible spiritual aspirant do? You carefully separate out the gol from the mal, the good from the bad, in any religion. Take the good and discard the bad. So you might say that, look, Hinduism is, if you look at the scriptures and Vedanta, you see wonderful teachings. At the same time, you find a certain misogynistic element in some of the scriptures, like Manusmriti. You find a hereditary caste system, not in the original scriptures, by the way. Bhagavad Gita never talks about a hereditary caste system, but it talks about caste, varna, based on guna and karma, your innate qualities and your behavior. This is the original caste system. I have a whole article on this, separate, not in this book, but called, provocatively, Was Swami Vivekananda a Hindu supremacist? Revisiting a long-standing debate. Because many people, including Jyotirmay Sharma, he's a scholar in India, he wrote a whole book attacking Swamiji, claiming that Swamiji loved the current caste system, which is complete nonsense. And so I point out that Swami Vivekananda distinguished the original caste system, which you find in the Gita, based on guna and karma, which is a wonderful idea, from the current caste system, which is based on heredity, which is the cause of all our problems, you see. So another thing I'll mention in the context of your second question is we should be very careful about, we shouldn't be too quick to assume that Hinduism, for instance, is based on the caste system in the bad sense, in the sense of the hereditary caste system. That'll be sloppy thinking, I think. We have to be very careful about that. And I say this because this is a clear and present danger. I was in Boston College a few months ago. I was invited to give a guest lecture in a graduate seminar there, and so I did, and that went fine. But the same professor, she's a brilliant lady and very prominent. I'm not going to name her name. You'll see why in a second. She invited me to sit in on her afternoon introduction to Hinduism class for a room full of undergraduates across majors. Okay, so scientists and everyone. young, impressionable minds. And she has a PowerPoint. And in the first day of class, this was the first day of her introduction, she says, Hinduism is based on the caste system. This is how she starts. This is in an academic, very good university. And not saying any, see, she's very clever. So she didn't actually like directly say the caste system is bad, but it's, you say caste system and everybody knows it's bad. And they assume it's the hereditary caste system. And she pulls out evidence from the Narayana Suktam and this and that, all sorts of stuff. But of course, that seems to be, arguably that refers to the original caste system. If you look at Gita, so then I raised my hand and I said, well, look, I think this is too facile. Because if you look at the Gita, caste is not defined in a hereditary way. It's based on guna and karma. And then we turned into a big argument. Why? Because the teaching assistant in the room, the assistant to the professor, he's a Christian missionary who spent time in India, I think Goa, working with the untouchables, the Dalits, and trying to convert them to Christianity by proving to them that their own religion maltreats them, which is sadly true, actually. The hereditary caste system is really terrible, genuinely so. So we should be ashamed, and we should try to eliminate it as quickly as possible. That's certainly true. Swamiji said he hoped that the hereditary caste system would die a natural death. And he also said, though, but the original idea of the caste system is a wonderful one. Any well-functioning society is one that allows you to pursue the line of work or calling or vocation that best aligns with your temperament and your strengths. You see, if I'm meant to be a doctor and society forces me to be a lawyer, I'm not going to be a very good lawyer. I won't be happy in my life, and I'm also not going to be able to maximally contribute to society. If I'm meant to be an artist and I'm given the resources and the scope to become an artist, I benefit myself, I benefit this world as well. You see, that's the idea behind the original caste system. Heredity comes in later. That's what Swami says is a degeneration of the original caste system. That's just one example, but I hope that begins to answer the question. Yeah, other questions? Mira?
Maharaj, so talking about like individual, like our spiritual practices. So about sincerity and following like practices, like our daily practices and grounding that as a part of your life. It goes back to an example you shared yesterday about, keep moving forward. You'll get there's going to be goodies, and the goodies are going to be even better, like the diamond mines and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, like just my own experiences, I think it just opens up more fear. And like in the sense, like it's a much harder journey
What is
than
the it here?
as even like doing your daily practice.
Mhm.
They're like, I feel their benefits. Like, I'm much more calmer when I show up in my workplace. I'm sure my colleagues might, be like, oh, today she's much more calmer and she's easier to work with, and there might be more difficult days. But I think what strikes me is that I'm not really open to what those experiences could be, because they challenge everything that I find comfort in. The way that there's a comfort in being ignorant in some ways. And then and the spiritual practice, actually you're trying to go after and break some of your own belief systems, whatever those are. And so I find that so challenging. And so it's like, maybe, and that fear pushes me back even more than it pushes me forward. And
Fear
so,
of what?
fear of, like, you get maybe a stronger sense of intuition, and it's just weird, or you get
Talk to your
either.
guru. It sounds like we're getting into
So
personal
then
territory. I'm not sure, but
so
are you initiated?
yes.
Yeah, so I would talk to your guru about that.
Okay.
I don't know if I can give you an answer without knowing you. But
Like I'm saying, it's not all that great. It doesn't, at least to me, it doesn't sound all that great all the time, or whatever it is.
what
It's
spiritual practice? Is that what you
spiritual
mean?
practices actually.
Well, it's
I'm like,
not
oh
meant
my
to. I mean,
gosh.
Gita chapter 18, it talks about sattvika joy, sattvika forms of happiness. Yattad agre vishamiva parinama imritopamam tat sukham sattvikam proktam atma buddhi prasadajam. It feels like poison in the beginning. It becomes like nectar in the end. And the real challenge for spiritual aspirants is to stick with it in the poison period. I say that when we first get initiated, many of you are initiated, you're given a mantra. And I've heard this from a number of devotees. During the initiation, weeping and then like some of them already have some vision of Sri Ramakrishna, and then, wow, wonderful. And then that's the beginning of what I call the spiritual honeymoon period. which lasts from anywhere from, I don't know, a couple hours to maybe a couple days, maximum a couple weeks. But eventually we all have to come back down to earth. And looking back on that vision of Sri Ramakrishna, we might say, well, maybe that wasn't exactly a vision of Sri Ramakrishna, it was something else. But anyway, then the poison starts. And the poison here is in the form of drudgery. It's mechanical. Do I really need to wake up that early? And I'm taking God's name, but there's no feeling behind it. You know? Can you persevere? Can you persist? Can you stick with the practice, even in the midst of that dark night of the soul, the difficulties, the challenges? That's the test. That's the challenge. Spiritual life is not meant to be comfortable or pleasant. That's just not. If you want a pleasant life, go for instant gratifications, because Gita defines instant gratification exactly in the opposite way. Vishayendriya sanyogad yattat agrem ritopamam pariname vishamiva tatsukham rajasam smritam. Instant gratifications are what? They're like nectar in the beginning and like poison in the end. So the pleasant life is based on instant gratifications, swiping on social media and this and that, looking at how many likes you're getting on this, blah, blah, blah. All sorts of, you name it. This is an age of instant gratification. There's no dearth of that. But what do people learn through hard experience? Even though it's like nectar and comfortable and beautiful and pleasant in the beginning, it's like poison in the end. And exactly the opposite structure obtains in the case of spiritual practices. Like poison in the beginning, after that initial honeymoon period. And then if you persist and persevere and you're sincere, it ultimately becomes like nectar. So stick with it is what I'd say. And talk to your guru about particular issues or challenges you feel on the path. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Anyone else?
Okay, well then, oh, go ahead.
Okay, one more question. And then I think we have a book signing, and then I have to drive to Dallas. Okay.
Namaste, Maharaj. I'm
Namaste.
trying to still reconcile various words that I have been reading about. For example, in Aurobindo, there is something called aspirations. I think he's talking about abhipsa. And that is very fundamental. He says that is very fundamental to faith. In Gita chapter 17, I read the same sort of a thinking in Shraddha Bhavati Bharata, something that is inherent in a person, inherent in men. And I'm trying to reconcile that with the today's discussion.
Yeah. So the thing is, in Sri Aurobindo often uses the term aspiration. Aspiration for the divine. I don't think that the best translation is the word you suggest. I think the best translation is Sri Ramakrishna's term, Vyakulata. Sri Aurobindo was not coincidentally influenced directly by Sri Ramakrishna and by Swami Vivekananda. He said that Sri Ramakrishna mystically communicated with him 3 times on 3 occasions. He studied Sri Ramakrishna's teachings very carefully in his life also. He said that when he was in jail for his political activities, he was a freedom fighter in Alipur in Kolkata. Swami Vivekananda came to him every night for a fortnight and taught him meditation techniques leading up to the supermind and things like this. So, Vyakulata. He says that genuine spiritual practice you should try to cultivate that aspiration for the divine in the sense of Vyakulata, that longing for God, that intense longing for God. How does that relate to the talk? Well, as I said, that's the whole second stage. Faith, if you genuinely believe that God exists, you should be full of that longing to realize God. You should be full of that intense aspiration for the divine. How many of us can honestly say that we have this intense aspiration for the divine? That's the test. So let's try to cultivate it. Don't despair. Don't feel bad about yourself. Don't beat yourself up. But tell yourself, I'm not there yet. Let me keep working at it. Let me not pretend that I'm more advanced than I really am. Yeah, thank you.
I guess, Swamiji, last question I'll ask probably. Can you connect theological determinism to the faith lecture that you just gave?
Okay, interesting. So he's clearly read my work and watched a lot of my lectures. So in numerous places in my work and in my talks, I talk about free will, this big $1 million question, do we have free will? I gave a lecture in Hollywood a few months ago called Do We Have Free Will, I think. And the answer, on my understanding, based on our tradition, is no. Again, the trigger warning and all that. But it's a little bit more involved than that. What does Sri Ramakrishna say? In reality, we don't have free will. But that's only part of the answer. He says, but so long as we have not realized God, God has, in her infinite wisdom and love, implanted in us the illusion of free will in order to prevent us from committing even more sin than we already are. We're already doing a lot of stupid things. It would have been a much worse situation if God had not implanted in us the illusion of free will, which then implants it, which then grounds the feeling of moral responsibility for our actions. You see, the conscience pricks us when we do something bad. We know it. Even if we don't tell anyone else, if we do something bad, we're going to have difficulty sleeping at night if it's something really bad. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, when we realize God, we realize that God alone is the doer. And then somebody asked Sri Ramakrishna, well, then can't I justify all of my sinful actions by saying that God is doing all these sinful acts through me? And he quotes Duryodhana in Mahabharata. Yatha niyuktosmi tatha karomi. Sri Ramakrishna smiles. He says, go ahead and try. More or less, I'm paraphrasing. Go ahead and try to live in this world as if God is the doer. And you're going to fall flat on your face. Because it's not possible. Again, it's related to this idea of doxastic voluntarism. You can't just decide to believe that God alone is a doer and that you have no free will. Go ahead and try and you're going to fail. A very recent example, Robert Sapolsky, has anyone heard of him? Stanford neuroscientist. He just wrote a book called Determined. And he says, from my teenage years, I believed that we didn't have free will. He said I believed. And then he said, but you know what? When push comes to shove, I can't help but feel as if I'm free. He admits. And if something terrible were to happen to his family or something, would he get angry? And would he get angry specifically at the perpetrator? And would he not want to punish that person? Yes, he says it. So this is Sri Ramakrishna's view. Now, how does it relate to this talk? The idea is, just keep in mind, so long as we've not realized God, we cannot help but think that we are free. We cannot help but feel that we're morally responsible for our actions. So therefore, we have to take responsibility for ourselves, and we should try to be sincere spiritual aspirants and try to purify our minds to the best of our ability, even if, from the ultimate standpoint, we have no free will, because that doesn't help us. And in fact, even if we tried to believe that God alone is a doer, we couldn't. It's not possible until we realize God. So standpoints, keep these standpoints distinct and we won't have confusions. That's the hope.
Well, thank you. After this is done, we are going to have the book signing, and so if anyone needs to buy the book, he will be happy to sign it for you. And after that, we are going to have a lunch prasad when this is done.
Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Thank you, everyone.